Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Maj. I'm a professor of Nordic literature at University of Southern Denmark, and I'm one of the editors of Nordic women's literature. And I'm here with my colleague, Lucie Duggan. She's a literary researcher here at SDU, and she has just started a research project on the library of the noblewoman Karen Brahe. Karen Brahe was born in Zealand, and she grew up as a landowner and a founder of an endowment. She was a collector of books, and she received a scholarly and humanistic education. And she also knew Latin. She used her assets to found a school, a hospital, and in 1716, Odense Convent for unmarried women of rank, that became an really interesting and important place of learning and study for unmarried noblewomen. Karen Brahe collected books and rare manuscripts, and in particularly older Danish manuscripts, and she also inherited a book collection from her relative Anne Goy. Karen Brahe's library and collections are the only surviving private collections of that period. They contain many unique manuscripts and books, and in Nordic women's literature, Marianne Alenius, the researcher Marianne Alenius, she has presented her groundbreaking research on Karen Brahe and her library, an important work that showed that many aspects of Karen Brahe and her library, but also opened up to new research. And we are so lucky that Lucie Duggan has currently a postdoctoral researcher here at SDU, and she's a PI of the Augustinus-founded research project Reading Women, Karen Brahe, and Female Book Ownership. And in a way, she takes up what Marianne founded in Nordic women's literature. And I hope that you today will explain us a little about your take on this topic, and why is Karen Brahe so important? What is interesting about her, in your opinion?
Yes, thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It's wonderful for me to have the opportunity to speak with you here. And to tell you a little bit more about my project that I have begun. As you mentioned, it's titled Reading Women, Karen Brahe and Female Book Ownership in Denmark, 1609 to 1736. And as you point out, it's funded by the Augustinus Fonden, and it began in March and runs until September 2024. And so with this project, I hope to investigate the private library of the Danish noblewoman Karen Brahe, who lived from 1657 to 1736. And as you point out, the collection begins before Karen Brahe's own lifetime with the noblewoman Anne Goy, who began the collection in her own lifetime and then left it to her grandniece Karen Brahe, who then in turn left it to the Odense Jomfru Kloster. So I would say that the collection is an important example of a Danish private library that was exclusively female. It was very much gathered by women who clearly valued and cherished books and identified as book owners, and it was intended for the use of other women. And so with the project, the main research question that I'm very much asking is, what did early modern Danish women read? And I think that this is a very important question to ask in the first place, because our knowledge of early modern book ownership and reading practices has traditionally been informed by our knowledge of the books and libraries of men. So while we know quite a lot about the reading practices of elite educated men in the early modern period, we know much less about what women read and how they read. So while we know that many early modern women did read and own books, particularly women from wealthy, aristocratic or noble families, we tend to lack substantial evidence of women's book ownership in the period. And where we have signs of female book ownership surviving in libraries or rare book collections, the scale of the evidence tends to be relatively small. And this is where, for me, the Karen Brahe library is so fascinating and exceptional. Not only has it survived intact to this day, it is also a very large collection. It contains 3,500 printed items and 1,150 manuscript items, so over 4,000 items in its entirety. And this is a very substantial size for a private library in this time, particularly when we compare it with what we know of women's libraries in other parts of Europe in the same period, where we know that women's book collections appear to have been much smaller on average. And so we can say that we have a volume, a sheer volume of works in this collection, which is of course wonderful in that it represents a very a rich amount of data, but it's also something of a challenge, because I think we could say that there are obvious difficulties and challenges involved with studying such an amount of rare and vulnerable material. But fortunately, the collection has been very carefully catalogued, and these catalogues, which we have access to, are fascinating resources in themselves, and they give us access to an extremely rich amount of information about each individual item in the Canberra collection. And so with my project, the aim is to use these catalogues to create a comprehensive digital database of the collection's contents, and I will then use this data to examine patterns, broad patterns of female book ownership in the period. So I suppose I'm interested in information such as the title of the work, the author of a work, the language that it was written in, either the original or whether it was translated into other languages, date of publication or of writing, genre, the genre of a work. So we have access to genre categorization such as theology, history, literature, and so on. The provenance of an item, whether it was, for example, bought at auction, whether it was inherited, gifted from another person, and whether the book has been written in either by Canberra or one of the many other hands that we see appearing throughout the collection. And I'm particularly interested in this because it gives us an insight into, as you mentioned earlier, these networks of transmission that are quite important in a collection like Canberra's, where women particularly are seen to pass books on from one another down through generations.
Because one of the ideas of Marianne Lenius is that we tend to understand these learned women as very lonely figures that are pictured all on their own in their study, but actually they had the connections and relations, and they met and discussed things and exchanged manuscripts. So there was a kind of network between these women also in Scandinavia.
Yes, I would agree very much with that. I think that's what we see from the collection itself, that these books were passed along between women connected on various levels, mostly by family ties, for example. Canberra herself and her aunt, her grand aunt Annika before her, were very careful to acknowledge the lineage of the book that they had in their care, whether it was passed down from family members to them, and so I think that this was very important to them. The idea of a book, as you say, is something under collective ownership, as it were, and it's also important to acknowledge, you know, the Canberra's intention that her books be left to the women in the Lianfu Cloister, or the convent for unmarried noblewomen, that these women would also have access to this sort of collective shared experience of reading. So this is what I'm interested in when I speak of reading practices, something, as you say, that goes beyond the individual book owner and our sort of more contemporary notions of possession and ownership as being something quite linked to the individual. But this appears to be something or a feature of a collection that indicates something more collective and shared.
I know that you've just started your project and you have years ahead, but still, what has surprised you the most up to now? Have you found anything surprising and things that you didn't expect, or things that pleased you very much that you found this in the library? It's I know it's over 4,000 objects.
Yes. It's a very good question. I think there are so many things that I find really endlessly fascinating about this collection. Perhaps the main one that stands out for me is the breadth of the contents of the collection and the sort of topics or genres that are covered in it. So I think that many of us, or at least the scholarship, would generally point to a tendency in women's libraries in the period to focus on theological works, Bible, prayer books, psalm books, and so on. And of course, they are very much the dominant genre of the Canberra collection. But I'm particularly interested in works that fall beyond that genre in more miscellaneous categories. I'm very interested, for example, in the presence of ephemeral works in the collection. So printed in newspapers, we might call them, from the period, that seem to tell us a lot about the sort of the cultural life or society that of her time and the time of her aunt and so on, and also works that we might consider surprising for their appearance in a women's catalog, a woman's library of this period. For example, medical books on anatomy, veterinary tracts. I think that these are also works that point to quite a wide range of interests that Canberra herself must have had, and also points to her life beyond her library. And as you mentioned, she was a very able administrator of her lands and so on. And I think we see many signs in the library of these interests and her role as a landowner and manager and administrator of her estates.
What does this library mean to contemporary readers? Why should our time and the readers today be interested in this old library and this noble woman Canberra? Why is she fascinating? What does she mean to us? What can the library mean to our understanding of the history of literary culture and the history of readers, do you think?
I think it's important to say that we still miss so much information about what women, the literary and intellectual culture of women in this period. So this is something that we must look and take all of the knowledge that comes to us from a library such as this. I think it's these books and collections have gone unnoticed for quite some time, and it's important that we today are aware that we perhaps only have half the picture when we think about, for example, intellectual literary culture of the early modern period, because it doesn't quite account for the apparently quite important role that women also had as readers and book owners, of course. I would also say that we tend to view historical artifacts with a degree of detachment. We often feel that these objects, such as old books, rare books, are unfamiliar to us, and they become less familiar to us with the passage of time, of course. But for me, what's fascinating about these old books is that they give us a chance to see how people interacted with them in the past, how people marked their books, how they inscribed themselves as authors, owners, or readers on the pages of the books. And I think that these very small traces can open up for us today the possibility for connection and recognition and empathy with the past and those who lived before us. So I think it gives us access, in a sense, and replaces this detachment that we might often have with something closer to connection. As I said, it increases our understanding of the past.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Lucie, for sharing your ideas with us. And I'm sure that we will follow up and return when you have worked a little bit more on the project and learn about your about what you found and your new ideas and this. So thank you for participating today.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie.
Bye-bye.